So, what was Abraham Lincoln's role in the emancipation? This is also something I talk about in the video, but not nearly enough because there's not enough time. It's kind of a separate subject, but I want to talk to you today about something called colonization. Hit me up in the chat if you know what colonization is. The thing that we do. So that is colonization, but it's not the colonization. It's not the definition of colonization I was looking for. It's a different kind of colonization. I mean, it is that, but it has a very different vibe to it. So when Abraham Lincoln was working on the Emancipation Proclamation, he didn't write it and go like from the moment. He didn't write it just like, I'm gonna like drop this on the world and I will be the great figure who emancipates the slaves. At like every second he was writing it, just being like, I'm gonna be the great emancipator. Yes. No. Lincoln wrote the Emancipation Proclamation in case he needed to use it as a military measure. Lincoln didn't write it out like, oh boy, I'm gonna end slavery today. No, Lincoln was like, I'm writing this out because I want to have Plan B ready when Plan A doesn't work out. Plan B, the Emancipation Proclamation, was to emancipate enslaved people in the rebellious states. That's 3.5 million enslaved. To emancipate them and have them join, if they are eligible, the Union Army as soldiers and healthcare workers. So that was Plan B. All right? That's what we ended up with. That's why our society is like it is, because Plan B happened. Plan A was different. Plan A was to compensate every state a fee to sell off their enslaved labor force and then take people of color. I don't know if Lincoln believed that all people of color, I mean, he did say, you'll see, he says some weird stuff, but to take African American people and have them go somewhere else, have them leave the country. That was Plan A. Got it? Plan B was emancipate and attempt to integrate and live with. Plan A was compensate for emancipation and ship them off so that they could colonize some other part of the world and be a friendly country to the United States. So in 1862, as Lincoln's working on the Emancipation Proclamation in the summer, just give me a second here, on July 12th, 1862, so he begins it in June, begins writing it in June. On July 12th, 1862, Lincoln makes an appeal to Congress to consider colonization. On July 21st, 1862, he's heard talking with his cabinet about the subject. In particular, he's talking about a potential venture to the Chiquiri region. Let's find this. So this was the first idea that Lincoln was presented with from a colonization society. A colonization society was a group of like philanthropic, rich pro-abolition people who raised money for back to Africa or colonize Caribbean islands or colonize South America projects. So this was actually an imperialist project, colonization. It's not just it was not just deport. It was like U.S. could have more influence in the Western Hemisphere by having a friendly black country that is separate from the United States but provides that U.S. trades with and has a security base. So they were hoping to have this like black populated security base country here in Panama. Let's zoom out a little bit so you can see where we are. Okay, so that's the Chiriquí region. Yeah. So this was the Chiriquí region. And so here's the deal. In the period of the Civil War, I don't know exactly what's going on up here, but the northern part of Central America is kind of like attempting this sort of pan Central America thing, like this one country thing where they'll all be united. But they're having a lot of troubles, especially Guatemala's the strongest country in this region. This region here in northern Panama was actually under the captaincy of the Colombian country, of Colombia. So this was all part of Colombia here. And it was, this was a much more, like this was a more Spain-dominated kind of like stronger country. And so they owned this region, but there was really nobody allowed to live there. So I've actually been to this region of Panama. I was like blown away when I found out that this was the place Lincoln was originally thinking they would go. This is the Chiriquí region. David is the main city, David. It's a really boring city. I've been there. And then I went to Boquete. I had a friend who lived. His father had a plantation. Frankly, I stayed on what it wasn't like. I don't think there were like plantation workers, but it was like a mini. It was like, yeah. I mean, I think it was a plantation. I'm not exactly sure. Anyway, that's the world we live in. It's a pretty scary place. Abraham Lincoln stayed on slave plantations too in his life. Yeah. So. Let's see. Act for Supplemental Appropriations for Sundry Civil Services approved July 16th. The first of these was to aid in the colonization and settlement of freed people. I'm going to say people, not the other word, because I feel uncomfortable saying that word, even in a historical context. So I'm just going to say people. Already residing in the district, together with those to be liberated by this act who might desire to emigrate to the republics of Haiti or Liberia or such other countries beyond the limits of the United States as might be determined by the president, provided that not more than $100 were spent for each emigrant. So they wanted to do it on the cheap too. That's the other part about it that's like, and you're going to see there's a disaster that takes place. The larger of these two appropriations was to enable the president to carry out the emancipation of the people in the district and to colonize those freed by the probable passage of a confiscation bill. So they were going to try to, Lincoln emancipated, or I should say the Congress, and Lincoln signed off on the emancipation of the enslaved in Washington, D.C. And that was a big deal. That was a big deal. That was like, whoa. It's like when you heard, such and such city legalized weed, and you were like, whoa, this is the beginning of something. When the people of Washington, D.C. were freed, this was a big deal. And it was a compensated emancipation. And Lincoln wanted to show that he could do the full program. Watch as the model city, watch as Washington, D.C. frees and then colonizes off their entire black population. Okay. So, let's see. So there was some weird corruption shit that went on as well with the company, the Chiriquí company. They wanted the folks who were going to this region to mine coal. Look at all this permission from stockholders. This was supposed to be an economic, pillaging adventure. They were sending them to mine coal from South America. I mean, nothing about this is good, right? Okay. Let's see if I can get to the part where it gets really weird. Okay, so on July 12th, Lincoln made his ineffectual appeal to the border state members of Congress for the adoption of compensated gradual emancipation accompanied by colonization in South America. So Lincoln got his compensated emancipation in Washington, D.C. He was getting his colonization project ready, and he wanted the border states to support it. The border states were the slaveholding states that remained neutral in the war. He wanted them to support it so that the whole middle region of the country could be a model for how to end slavery peacefully by colonizing African Americans. When the border states said, no, we are not interested in freeing them at all, that is when Lincoln issued Plan B, the Emancipation Proclamation. Okay, having done that, once Lincoln passed that line, once he crossed that line, he scarcely ever looked back. And he pushed for emancipation wholeheartedly. But that was not his original plan. And if things had gone a little differently, Lincoln could have had a much different legacy. Right? Lincoln said, I confess plainly, on recalling this time period, that events controlled me. I did not control the events. You'll hear that in the video tomorrow too. I'm spoiling everything here. So you get to hear a little bit about the negotiations with the Colombian government, about using Panama. Then on August 14th, oh my God. August 14th is a day that will live in Lincoln infamy. August 14th, never forget. August 14th, 1862. The day Abraham Lincoln invited a congregation of African American leaders to come to the White House. And when they walked through the door, President Lincoln told them, but for your race among us, there could be no war. He lectured them on how enslavement had what's the word I'm looking for? Had hurt, how slavery had cast a curse upon the white race. He talked about how the white race suffered from the existence of slavery, how the war caused them to suffer, which, I mean, that's understandable, that part, because the war was terrible. But he said that it was your presence here that caused the war. And then he continued and said, I have been given reports that there are great natural resources in the Central American region and many advantages. That this region could be a great highway from the Atlantic to the Pacific. Think of that. You could be on the great highway between the Atlantic and the Pacific. Okay? With harbors among the richest in the world. Lincoln's really trying to make this sound like a good deal. Moreover, he continued, there was evidence of very rich coal mines. If intelligent men, such as are before me, would move in this matter, much might be accomplished. Okay. He thought the venture might begin successfully with as few as 25 able-bodied men with a mixture of women and children. And it's funny because I did an episode not too long ago about James K. Polk and how at one point in his presidency he had a Mormon problem. It's so hard being white in this year 18. Yeah. That's some full-on aggrievement. Where was I? Got knocked off for a second. Yeah. He asked the listeners to consider the proposition seriously. And as not pertaining to yourselves merely, not for your race and ours for the present time, but as one of the things, if successfully managed, for the good of mankind, not confined to the present generation, but as to into eternity. Yeah. The congregation was perplexed. Oh, James K. Polk. James K. Polk had a Mormon problem. He needed to get rid of a bunch of Mormons who were they're living in Iowa, basically. They had a town in Illinois. Their town got burned down, and they had to run and be refugees in Iowa. And at the time, Iowa was really developing, and the development was crunching down on where the refugee Mormons were, and there was going to be problems again between the Mormon population and the white settler population that was there, and also the Dakotas that were living there as well, who allied with the Mormons to some degree. But Polk basically convinced them to go march to California. So colonization is not something that it's like colonization's happened. That's the thing about colonization. It's happened, like removal, colonization. Where's the line there? Like, when is it removal? When is it sending an expedition to, go exploit the resources of some place? It's really both a lot of times. It's always removal. James K. Polk wanted to remove the indigenous population, and the Mormons were hanging out with the indigenous population and making friends with them, and they didn't get along with the white settler population. So Polk opted to peacefully remove them by conscripting them in the military and marching them to California. So that's what Abraham Lincoln is proposing here. Abraham Lincoln, of course, was a congressman during the Polk administration, a vocal critic of the president. Nonetheless, presidents criticize when they're not yet president, then they become the president, and they understand, they like all the presidents that they used to hate, right? Barack Obama, he said so much stuff, so trash talked so much of George Bush, but he became president, and he loves George Bush. He's like best friends with George Bush, admires George Bush, right? So Abraham Lincoln would speak out against Andrew Jackson, but when he became president, he looked to Andrew Jackson a lot for guidance. And so removal is a part of the Jackson package. The Jackson package, I like that. Welcome to my concert. We're called the Jackson Package. Come and see us anytime soon. Yeah. So the delegation was not really happy about it. Secretary Chase, the Secretary of State, wasn't into it, thought the whole thing was a scam based in prejudice, and he advocated very forcefully, along with Salmon Chase, not to do this, that it was going to be a disaster. So it eventually fell through. The Chiquiri project fell through. But they attempted colonization in Haiti, Vache. So I'm going to read you a little bit about that now, because this is the one that basically, after they failed, they still attempted some colonization projects even after the Emancipation Proclamation was passed. In fact, Lincoln Secretary John Hay complained that it was like kind of embarrassing how long Lincoln clung to this unreasonable fantasy that African American population could be colonized out of the country, could be removed. There was 4 million in the South. There was millions more in the North. But of course, the problem for African Americans in the time was that life in the South was intolerable because of enslavement, but the North was like this because they were afraid that a wave of refugees would come rushing. I mean, that's what happened, actually, that a wave of refugees would come into the North and come into the northern cities, and that like these Northerners would have to live with black people. So they were very defensive and like very aggressive and violent towards incoming African Americans. And so there was that difficulty there. So there were some black folks who supported the idea of colonization. And even later in history, Marcus Garvey, you'll see Back to Africa movements are popular. And that's when they're coming from the black community. But this is not coming from the black community. This is coming from the white community. And its agenda is not to create a homeland for African Americans. Its agenda is to get rid of them and like maybe lighten their conscience and maybe even get like a little geopolitical boost by having a U.S. friendly African American regime planted in Panama that would mine coal for the U.S. Navy. So that's an interesting version of what could have happened at the end of enslavement that you don't normally hear about. Give me a second here. So that's Vache. This is another place they wanted to colonize. The tiny Vache, 12 miles offshore the city of Aux Cayes on Haiti's long southern peninsula, was approximately 13 miles long and 7 miles wide. It embraced some 100 square miles of grassy plain and tropical rainforest, rising to a central plateau of 300 feet elevation. Once a famed pirate resort, Vache had belonged at one time to a private French company and to the Duc de Pralines. Oh, yummy pralines. Gotta love those pralines. Now in 1862, it was under lease again to an American businessman named Bernard. We're going to say Coke, all right? I'm not saying cock. Action Pap, you got it right. This is definitely a Fire Fest situation. Not to make light of it, but it's true. Coke's contract with the government of Haiti gave him exclusive rights to cut timber and cultivate the soil for 10 years, guaranteeing military protection if needed. Okay, so a company man went to this island to get wood. Cock went to get wood, and they sent a military protection for him. In return, some 35% of the mahogany and other hardwoods harvested was to be delivered to Port-au-Prince, and Coke promised that workers supplied for the enterprise would belong to the African race and would become naturalized Haitians as soon as possible. Okay, so this was an attempt to make them Haitians instead. Coke appeared in Washington in September 1862 and contacted Secretary of the Interior Caleb B. Smith, who was immediately fascinated by the details Coke supplied. The prospects were far more enticing than those of Chiquiri, and certainly less complicated by matters of protocol and diplomacy. As Coke told it, there were no local inhabitants to contend with, and no one would be allowed to set foot there without permission save Haitian officials. It was his own personal island. He would provide employment at standard wages, a house and garden for each family, medical care, schools, and churches. After 10 years, the government would give full title to the land, 8 acres for every single man and 16 for each head of family. Every tropical or temperate product would find as ready a market in Haiti as the hardwoods which were to make Coke's own furniture. All he asked of the United States was transportation for the colonists and an advance of funds sufficient to purchase supplies for the initial acclimatizing period. All right, so not bad, but total farce also. A printed appeal to Lincoln congratulated him, blah, blah, blah. All right. Contract for 5,000 people to be sent to this very small island to work for this guy and have 8 acres of land. I mean, I've definitely agreed to some jobs. Okay. But yeah, doesn't it have that Firefest vibe? It's like, Emily, I know you were always hanging out on Who is Damon. Do you remember how Who is Damon did like the Jared Leto thing and was going through like the packages, the different packages they had, like what they offered at the Jared Leto cult event? And it was like, it just seemed so fishy, you know? It just looked like so wrong. Okay, so let's switch over to this so you can actually see what I'm reading here. Lincoln's interest was evident from his correspondence with Senator Samuel C. Pomeroy of Kansas. This was the big support of the Chiquiri Project. Let's keep that there. All right. Let's take a look real quick where Vache is, so you guys know. Actually, you can't see it. Hold on. Vache, right here. So that's Haiti. That's the big. It's not that big already. That what you're seeing is not that big, and that's that big compared to that. And that's 5,000 people. We're gonna go there to work for this guy. Anyway. So, this is an interesting part that we're going to see here. The distress of the 6,000 people at Fort Monroe, Virginia, may have influenced Lincoln to proceed despite the senator's misgivings. So there's this place, Fort Monroe, Virginia, and there are 6,000 refugees of enslavement there, and Lincoln is like pulling out his hair like, what are we going to do with all these refugees? If they get sent north, they're gonna get they're gonna face the racism of the North. Like, they're gonna the people of the North are gonna be pissed off, and they're gonna riot maybe, which they did riot. They had a lot of race riots. So these material conditions forced these African American people into this very bad choice that they had to make between going north, taking their chances living in the north of the United States, which was hugely racist, or like just being encamped in a refugee camp in Fort Monroe. And that's, when people started saying, what if we colonized them somewhere? Hold on one second. All right. So all the able-bodied men and women were put to work on jobs which ranged from constructing breastworks and gun emplacements to raising food for the army mess and digging for oysters. Schools and church facilities were inadequate. In answer to questions posed by visitors, the people said they had come for freedom, but would gladly return to their former plantations if they could be unmolested. No one wanted to go north. Obviously, here was the opportunity to give colonization the fair trial it deserved. Yeesh. All right. No sooner had the Koch contract been signed, however, than the troubles began to mount for the harassed president. Disquieting reports reaching the State Department on Bernard Koch caused first a hasty consultation between Seward, the Secretary of State, and the new Secretary of the Interior, John Usher, and then an emphatic refusal to grant certification. Needless to say, Koch protested vehemently. The disposition of his affairs, the heavy purchases made, the requirements of tropical settlement all made it urgent that no time be lost. This has to happen now. Yet the evidence against him could not so easily be brushed aside. So they found a lot of corruption going on with this guy. First, there was a letter from a tobacco merchant describing a fraud perpetrated years earlier by Koch. So there's bad stuff on this guy, Koch. And associates in New Orleans, in which several hundred hogshead of inferior tobacco were sold in Europe. Oof. What a scandal. By the time the swindle had been discovered, Koch had fled and no further action was taken. The second read like a romantic novel and involved a detective named Merrick who shadowed Koch, found him to be in company with known Southern sympathizers, and claimed to have seen in his correspondence a letter from the famed captain of the Alabama, Raphael Sames. It was alleged that Koch was to receive liberal rewards if he allowed the Vache settlers to be sold into slavery in Cuba. So there was Cuba had slavery, and it was the Spanish Empire. The Spanish Empire still allowed it. So there was this thought of, is this guy just trying to make a quick buck by selling a buttload of he's moving product. That's the way he's thinking. This could be he could make a killing selling all of these desperate people in these refugee camps off to Cuba. Okay. So there was that. The third was from Benjamin Whidden, United States Commissioner, Resident Minister in Haiti, who had seen no evidence, he said, of preparations for a major undertaking on the island. People in Port-au-Prince considered Coke an adventurer and a rascal. Determined to see at least one colonization venture come to fruition, Lincoln had waited until March 1863 before negotiations were resumed on a new contract, one that omitted any mention of Bernard Coke. Two New York merchants, Paul Forbes, Charles Tuckerman, who had invested in the Coke scheme and were consequently in considerable financial distress, offered to take a smaller group of 500 contrabands. That was the name for escaped enslaved people. They were called contraband of war. That was the only way they could be freed at first, because they were property of the Southern slaveholders, and so by confiscating them, i.e. emancipating them, you were taking away enemy supplies. So that was what they called them, contraband. Okay? Should give you really a sense of like the kind of choices black people in this country have had to make. Okay? That's something you need to think about when you're trying to like think about, you know, what it'd be like, or like try to understand their point of view. How about try to understand the idea that you'd have to make a decision like that you'd have those kinds of options because you're enslaved. That's deep, right? Okay, to be a contraband, to run away, to be a contraband, that was your option. Damn. Forbes and Tuckerman were accorded the highest praise by all who were contacted concerning character and business ability, and were given the approval of the State Department as well. Lincoln could see no danger in granting them a sum of $50 per person colonized. This time there would be no embarrassing incidents. The Vache colony would provide the enlightened example so often spoken of as necessary if Americans were to be aroused to the benefits of racial separation. Colonization ought to be the national aim, and Tuckerman, in denying that their interest is a pecuniary one, said, if it be the purpose of this government simply to rid the country of its surplus colored population, there is no question but that means of transportation much less expensive than at the rate of $50 per head can be procured. Wow. Well, if you're going to sell them off anyway, you might as well transport them for more cheaply. It's a very inspirational quote from this guy, Tuckerman. Yeah. It was like, monorail, hey, you got a problem? You know, it's like government contractors today. They're always trying to like, you got a problem with this? Oh, I can do that. I can build that bomb, you know. Oh, I can get rid of your colored population, you know, so. Woof. Surplus, exactly. Surplus colored population. Terrible phrase there. Unfortunately, no description has been preserved of the scene of departure at Fort Monroe, but lists of the emigrating people giving names, ages, place of origin. They were principally from Virginia, Tidewater region, Norfolk, Petersburg. This is getting into Thomas Jefferson territory. So a score or more came from North Carolina, one from Alabama. All right, so we have a bunch of people coming. They got on a ship called the Ocean Ranger, freed under the Confiscation Act. So they weren't freed under the Emancipation Proclamation. They were freed under the Confiscation Act. 450 of them on the ocean. They had safely landed at Vache. Personal interviews shortly afterward convinced him they were happy, the island was beautiful, the climate delightful, and all was flourishing under the able, wise, and humane direction of Bernard Coke. So, oh crap, he was still involved. They just kept his name out of all of the promotion for this. The latter piece of information was not at all pleasing to Washington. They were not happy to find that Mr. Coke was still involved. And an explanation was demanded from Forbes and Tuckerman. In their reply, they pointed out that Coke's presence was necessary to initiate the enterprise and to make good his contract with Haiti. Let's see the island. Okay. After all, he did start the whole colonization project. Yeah, and he signed the agreement with the president. Now in his hands, Coke was the subject to authority of the agent, Andrew Ripka. So he's not in charge of it all. We realize that although this is not the direct concern to you, it is something which should not be hidden or misconstrued. Knowing your attitude toward him, everything was proceeding satisfactorily. They concluded Haitian authorities had administered the act of naturalization, so they were Haitians now. They had full civil and political rights. They couldn't plant anything. That the rainy season was already there. So they paid them a little extra. Then rumors began to reach Secretary Usher. Rumors of death, disease, and dire poverty of the survivors. Yeah. That if substantiated would give the death blow to any further hopes of colonization as far as President Lincoln was concerned. James DeLong, the United States consul at Aux Cayes, told how Coke had appeared on the mainland considerably frightened and demanded military aid in suppressing an armed rebellion. The soldiers who took him back to Vache, good night, Emily, thanks for coming, arrested the man, he indicated, but upon further investigation were convinced that a grave injustice had been done to the immigrants. They told of being fed a diet of salt pork and moldy corn, of 40 deaths from illness and exposure because no houses had yet been erected, and of Coke's borrowing all their American currency on shipboard and subsequent refusal to return it. A personal visit by DeLong confirmed his fears. Coke allegedly told him that he was the proprietor of Vache and that no one had a right to come ashore without permission. He inspected the camp despite this threat and found it deplorable. The people gathered around with tears, misery, and sorrow pictured in every countenance. Small huts of brush and palmetto leaves gave no protection from the inclement weather. Many lay on boards or directly on the ground at the mercy of myriads of insects. The food was worse than he had ever imagined. All this while Coke and other whites lived in comparative luxury, heedless of the suffering surrounding them. This is very reminiscent of Jonestown, I have to say. This is very similar to what happened in Jonestown in Guyana. Jim Jones had a church. It was a largely African-American church. He decided to take them to his whole church to Guyana and found this like agricultural colony. It did pretty well for like the first year and a half, but then Jim Jones just ended up doing drugs and like hiding out in his room with a microphone and a loudspeaker, and he would just tell everyone on the farm that the American imperialists were coming to bomb them and that they had to stay on the colony. They had to stay in Guyana. This was the only place that'd be safe. He told them that they would be re-enslaved when the Americans came, and eventually he convinced them to all commit suicide. So this is like Jim Jones' story is a story of colonization, just like this one. Only in this case, they weren't religious. It wasn't a religious cult, but it had a lot of things in common with a religious cult experience. On October 9th, 1863, Secretary Usher wrote to D.C. Donahue, an old friend in Indiana, asking him to serve as special agent of the Department of the Interior to go to Vache and investigate conditions there at first hand. Ample funds would be provided, and the evidence collected was to be suitable for presentation in a court of law. So they went to a court of law, and they talked about this. And it was a disaster. They tried to send more money. Didn't do anything. There were 292 within 2 months of the expedition. 292 from almost 500. When the Mormons were marched across the Western territories, there was I think maybe 10 of them died, and it was terrible conditions. It was a terrible, horrible march. These are people standing still, and this was also, you have to remember too that a lot of white people propagated these lies about the natural adaptability of black folk to tropical climates. So they sent them to Haiti just being they're black, they'll survive. And they didn't, because it wasn't it was a new, unfamiliar environment, and it was a terrifying experience, as it would be for anyone who would be thrust into that with very little money paid, with costs being cut on your transportation and all that. So Coke was dismissed, ordered to leave. They received their wages. Their health improved, spirits rose. Usher consulted with the president and Secretary Seward at some length before the order for a relief vessel was given. Okay, so they sent a relief vessel. And in March, and by a certain point, I guess March, they brought them back, whoever was left. So that's colonization for you.